Good afternoon to all. I share with you some findings from a series of studies done on open and distance learning in Belize between 2013 to 2017. It's entitled, the one I'm sharing today, Online Instructional Pedagogy, Students' Perception or Experiences in Synchronous Distributed Courses. I will look at some context in terms of background information pertinent to open and distance learning, some reflection on the literature, very few given time limitation. I want to draw from one of my first studies that was conducted with teachers and administrators of teacher educational institutions in Belize. From a second study on students enrolled in synchronous distributed courses in the University of Belize, some concluding thoughts, some conclusions and recommendation. It is important to reflect on two key terms. We often use the word information society or information knowledge. And as I reflect on open and distance learning, or what we often call online instruction, it's important to bear in mind that the term information society or information knowledge, these terms are not stable. In fact, it is strongly policy oriented, and why? It is dependent on policies made when we speak of whether we're able to offer certain courses, if it's online or not. It also has national peculiarities. It depends on where you are, whether it's something we're doing nationally or otherwise. While the term information society is often used, it's important to also note that the concept of information society has been replaced by knowledge society. Why is that the case? From the learning point of view, knowledge society is far more attractive. It's a far more attractive goal than information society. And why is that? When we have knowledge, knowledge speaks of power, more understanding. It speaks more to the students, gathering pertinent facts to be able to become better learners. Indeed, the dream of open and distance learning is one that we must embrace. However, there are limitations. For example, we hear of LTE, long-term evolution, in Belize, and one would say that indeed we are ready, we're poised, we have what it takes to offer open and distance learning to transmit just anywhere at any given time. However, it's important to note that in many cases this is available in Belmopan, Belize City, and Ladyville at its best. That is, in those areas there may be faster data speed, video streaming without buffering. You can attach and view files and emails faster. A lot of availability in Belize City and Belmopan. One could also say that you could have streaming videos without buffering, video chats, clear video, voice, no buffering, and so on. So what I'm trying to indicate is that even as we believe we're poised, in many instances we're not. In fact, the accessibility, the quality is not accessible countrywide. And while we grapple at whether we are ready or are we poised to be able to offer high quality open and distance learning in Belize, it's important to note, as highlighted in a 2013 data, that today 20 households with average broadband usage generate as much traffic as the entire internet carried in 1995. So the demand is higher, there's more usage, and clearly it speaks to then one looking at how do we incorporate that within our institutions. And while it is good, and indeed we must embrace the change, we must recognize that it impacts how we learn, our way of life, and we must be cognizant of those changes if we're to embrace technology in education. For example, in 1990, you'd have the more traditional type television, and now you have a flat screen. More commodity, impact can impact your health. The outcome can be detrimental. But as we think of open and distance learning, I've often heard my colleagues mention that it is indeed offering opportunities any place, any time, any space. But what are the end results? Is it always positive? And so I looked very briefly to one set of literature by Einstein and Skidmore, and they surveyed 2 matched pairs of on-campus and online courses, one in statistics and another in economics. And their findings indicated that students in online format of the statistics class exam scored 14.1% less than the traditional format. And in the managerial economic class, the test scores within both formats were not significantly different. To highlight that, oftentimes one would argue that, well, if you're at home, in your own space, your own time, the results may be better. However, some findings indicate that that is not always the case. But indeed, we must embrace the fact that there are positives in all of this. For example, increased access. If we can offer open and distance learning via use of technology, more persons can become enrolled. Flexibility of content and delivery. I often say to my students, you can be at home on your sofas, reading, responding, and also becoming immersed in your educational processes. Combination of work and education, very learner center. It can provide high quality of education and new ways of interactions or engagement. So indeed, there are positives. But there are still controversial findings we must examine. And one could say, why look at the negatives? Let us just move ahead with the technology. It is important for us as a country to ask ourselves, how well does this work? What is the research stating? And how do we plan strategically to be able to embrace the perceived change? And so another controversial finding is on the impact of ICT on student achievement. A number of researchers are saying that while it is expected that there will be high impact, it is not always the case. A bit more research done in 2004 concluded that there is no evidence for a relationship between increased educational use of ICT and student performance. There's no evidence to say more online instruction, perhaps use of more videos, or whatever technological devices one wants to use, that you will have higher levels of performance. There's no real evidence to support that. In fact, they find a consistently negative and marginally significant relationship between ICT use and some student achievement measures. So important for us to bear these in mind. I will just go over this quite quickly to be able to save some time to indicate that other findings also indicate that the average scores were almost 15% higher for face-to-face than online. So indeed, as we plan in many of our institutions to embrace open and distance learning, some important elements must be critically reviewed, and we must be able to track and observe how well students respond to this type of instruction. So I looked to my first study, the one I did in 2013, looking at teacher educational institutions, and it included 5 tertiary teacher ed institutions in Belize. I used a 28 Likert scale instrument. It had various components, for example, teaching using web conferencing, online instruction, technical skills, teaching and online experiences, and perceptions of open schooling. That is having the opportunity to go to school wherever you are, but using the technology. In terms of the responses from teacher educators, not all the respondents have taught online or have used course management systems. So while we ask persons at times to teach a course online, in many instances, it may be their very first experience, hence a trial and error, hopefully perfected. One of the items which I marked as Item 4, it says majority use internet sources to identify suitable teaching strategies and resources. And if we look at the mean and standard deviation, there's a marked difference in terms of the mean and standard deviation, which speaks to the gap in terms of the responses and the major differences. Item 5, a few had not taken an online course or teaching online, but accessed electronic media to teach. So in 2013, a number of teacher educators were not necessarily teaching online, but were just accessing resources. Some had not even taught online at that time. But even as that is the case, we must acknowledge that these resources are not just there, and we ought to embrace them, because in fact, teachers' use of ICT as a means to support powerful learning environments should be fostered. We cannot say to ourselves there are limitations and so we will not embrace them, but we must embrace it if we are to survive in this technological era. So teachers should provide opportunities for children to use computers and therefore stimulating continued desire to use ICT in schools. Clearly that has to be the case. What is also important for us to consider that there's need for technical skills. Therefore, if an institution asks instructors to teach online but fails to provide the requisite training and support, this effort is deemed to fail. So we cannot say to ourselves, we're going to teach online, we're going to have all these courses online, but our personnel are not adequately trained. We must make sure, we must ensure that that is the case. Because teaching online really requires a different set of skills. It is not as if though you're teaching face-to-face. And I say that from experience as a student, having attended online classes and also as an instructor who teaches online. Other overview of the first research study, there were opposing views that teaching online will allow greater flexibility. Some people would say if you're teaching online, you don't go on campus all day, you can stay at home as the instructor, you live good, you don't have a class to meet twice weekly. However, that is not really the case. It's very labor intensive. However, 90% of the respondents perceived that online instruction was more difficult. So indeed, they were right on task in terms of what the research is saying. And it is indeed more labor intensive, and there's need for more time on task, reading forums, responding to students, and the likes. The study I want to highlight, before my minutes begin to be signal about my time, is the one I conducted in 2017. I've been monitoring in terms of the University of Belize and more so teacher educational institutions over the past 4 years. Use of open and distance learning, whether it's pure online or blended or hybrid modes. And I looked at 4 synchronous distributed courses with an enrollment of about 60 students. And the duration of this bit was from January to May 2017. And why only that length of time? This was our first attempt at the University of Belize to really teach a class face-to-face and at the same time transmit to persons all over the country. So we taught in our classroom, we had our students seated, and we were also at the same time, somebody in San Pedro could have seen the teacher ask questions while the live class was in session. And so some research questions, I did not want to write out the entire question, but the focus was students' perception of online learning, how did they perceive it within these synchronous distributed courses, effect on student satisfaction, impact of the instructional design in shaping students' perception of online learning, and promoting instructor interaction with students. So more of how they felt about the class, their interaction with the instructors, the quality of the delivery, and so on. One of the first findings I want to make reference to is that students enroll in high flex courses, meaning the face-to-face, and it's been seen in San Pedro wherever they are. They stated that while the experience was interesting, they preferred the traditional face-to-face So the students were saying, I mean, this is wonderful, but I prefer to be in a classroom. I really don't really think I like this quite a lot. A number of them stated that they would have preferred the traditional classroom. I also looked at their perceptions in trying to really ask them, how do you feel about all of this? Share your experiences, and this is critical because as a national university, we must be able to document. As we implement, we must be able to reflect on where we are and what are the implications in terms of future delivery of courses and so on. And so I'll just select a few, and this table is showing some measures of central tendency for ease of viewing some of the results. So, for example, I think online learning is interesting. Only 35% or 20 strongly agreed that, yeah, it's interesting. Another quick view is, I think online learning is enjoyable. Only 19% said they strongly agreed. If I could just pick another, taking online courses increases my productivity. Only 29% strongly agreed. So I'm really trying to indicate that even as it's very important, and we must get with it, as one would say, that the culture of online learning, whether it's fully online or blended, is one that is still in its initial phases, and the perception of how good it is still one that students are trying to grapple with. And then I looked at gender and mode of learning. Is it that the males perhaps liked using the technology more, or it's the females, or were there any significant difference between the two groups? And I used binomial tests were conducted to determine whether gender and mode of learning were there any differences. And proportion of online students and the proportion of females in the sample do not significantly differ. So if you look at the p-values, there were no significant differences. So it's not to say, well, maybe it's the males who were saying this, or maybe it's the females, but generally speaking, there were no difference between gender. I also focused on the table being projected. I have the skills that I looked at on the instrument. And for example, perceptions of online learning, perceptions of quality and usefulness of high-flex or synchronous distributed courses, and the instructor interaction. To my far, the Cronbach Alpha, you will note that the reliability of the instrument is very high. However, if you look at the difference between the mean and standard deviation, the widest spread occurs in the perception of online learning. So their perception, and one could question, is it the quality of the delivery of the course? Is it perhaps the use of the platform? Is it the engagement with the instructor? Is it that they were getting adequate feedback and all of that? And we have itemized those and focused on what were students' views as well, to be able to interpret how best to proceed. However, it's important to look at the perception of hybrid courses across 4 measures on the instrument. And we use the word hybrid here given that indeed some students were away from campus while others were in the classroom. So perceptions of hybrid courses across the 4 measures on the instrument were the same for students enrolled in teaching methods for secondary level and professionalism. So the perceptions in terms of the course were much the same. And we kept asking, are these experiences the same in this course and in this other course? In fact, there were 2 courses taught in that modality where we had the students in classrooms and transmitting live. And there were no difference in terms of experiences in either of the courses as indicated by the data. And 85% appreciated the convenience of online learning, because some would say, well, I don't have to come to class every day, I don't have to take a bus, I don't have to spend as much money to be traveling. However, 76% said they have the resources, the knowledge, and the ability to use the online, because we would ask them, so if your perceptions aren't that good, is it that you understand what you're doing? Do you know how to log in? Do you know how to access the resource? Do you know how to respond to the forum? Are you coping with the online platform and resources? However, 40% preferred and learned more in face-to-face courses than online. So while we could say that more than 50% said, well, this is fine and I will do this again. 40% said, no, give me back my traditional setting. I love that more. So some food for thought, because it's important to stop and ask the question, where are we now? Should we say to ourselves, well, these 40%, it's just 40%, and they'll be fine, and their wisdom tooth perhaps will grow out in the next 2 years, but we must be reflective because every student is of paramount importance. When these things occur, we say to ourselves, somebody must be blamed, and normally the person at the bottom gets most of the blame. Perhaps somebody did not do this did not work at one time, something went down, or when it should have been up, perhaps some software, whatever the case is. And while it's good to find out who's the culprit, the question lies in how do we fix it. But positive outcomes indeed is that ICT increases student engagement, which leads to an increased amount of time students spend working and so on. We have acknowledged that that is the case. Some conclusion is that there's need for more analysis of the effects of blended modality on performance. So we cannot say, we won't ever bother, my time is up, let me go quickly. We need to have appropriate resources. I'll just pick out the key points. Educators must be trained, must be given the skills to perform effectively. There's need for technical backup and support. Our technology must be of the best. We must have the bandwidth we need, the resources, and so on. Therefore, there's need for trained instructors, more resources for synchronous or asynchronous sessions, and the institutions must be ready. And when I say ready, not partially ready, but very ready to embrace open and distance learning. We must develop teachers' capacity, as said before, and we must have the infrastructure and the funding. We must reflect on national policies or structures in order to support this modality. In the curriculum for both initial teacher education and continuing professional development must be embraced. We want to assess students to ensure we have retention. We want to make sure that we have the most robust programs. And indeed, the work is not completed. This is from 2013 to current, and I believe it's an area that must be examined. We must be able to critically review what we do and plan to be most effective. Thank you very much.